For more than 30 years, a nation fought over a single question: who counts as Cherokee? On one side stood the descendants of people the Cherokee had once enslaved, holding a promise made to their ancestors. On the other stood a tribal government that had decided belonging came down to blood. Everyone assumed the answer would come from ancestry, that somewhere in the genome lay the verdict on who was really in and who was out. The fight finally ended. But the thing that ended it was the discovery that the whole question had been built on a lie, and the blood everyone was arguing about was never the point at all. Let's be clear about what kind of story this is, because it's not the one the headline leads you to expect. This is a story with a definitive resolution, and that resolution lives in real documents you can read. A federal court ruling from 2017, a Cherokee Nation Supreme Court ruling from 2021, and a treaty signed in 1866. Those are the anchors. And to understand why DNA could not be the referee everyone assumed it would be, there's one more essential source: the work of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyat scholar Kim Tallbear, whose book Native American DNA, published by the University of Minnesota Press, is the definitive account of why a genetic test can't tell you who belongs to a tribe. Hold those together and you have everything you need: a treaty, 2 court rulings, and the science of what DNA can and cannot actually do. Because the popular instinct, whenever a question of Native identity comes up, is to reach for a cheek swab, to imagine that the truth of who someone is sits waiting in their cells, ready to settle any argument the moment the results come back. That instinct is so common and so deeply wired into how Americans now think about identity, that it quietly shaped how most people assume this entire conflict must have been resolved. Surely, somewhere somebody tested the blood and got an answer. It is also, as the Cherokee Freedmen's own history proves, completely wrong. And the gap between what people assume and what actually happened is the whole reason this story is worth telling. To see why, you have to start with a part of American history that almost nobody is taught in school. The Cherokee Nation owned slaves. That sentence stops people, and it should. We are used to a single story about Native Americans in the United States, a story of dispossession and the Trail of Tears. And that story is true and devastating. But it sits alongside another truth that is rarely told in the same breath. The Cherokee, along with the other nations the government called the 5 civilized tribes, had adopted plantation slavery, owned enslaved people of African descent, and brought those enslaved people with them on the forced march west to Indian Territory in the 1830s. Black people walked the Trail of Tears too, in bondage. By the time of the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation held as many as 2,500 enslaved people of African descent. Some wealthy Cherokee families ran plantations that would have looked familiar anywhere in the antebellum South. Judge Hogan, in his later ruling, would describe this with unusual moral directness, noting that while the Cherokee story is steeped in the sorrow of being marginalized and removed by the United States, it is less widely known that the nation's own chronicle shares what he called the shameful taint of African slavery. 2 histories of suffering, running side by side, one folded inside the other. When the Civil War came, the Cherokee Nation, deeply divided, largely sided with the Confederacy. And when the war ended, the United States forced the defeated tribes into new treaties as the price of peace. The Cherokee signed theirs in 1866. Its terms abolished slavery in the nation forever. And in a single decisive clause, Article 9, it declared that the freed people and all their descendants would have, in the treaty's own words, all the rights of native Cherokees, not partial rights, not a lesser, separate tier. All the rights. The people who had been held as property became, by the nation's own signed word, Cherokee citizens. And that word, signed at the end of the most catastrophic decade in the nation's history, would still be binding 150 years later, and would one day be tested in court by their descendants. And here's the part that complicates every neat racial category. These were not strangers to the Cherokee. Many of the formerly enslaved had Cherokee ancestry themselves, the children and grandchildren of Cherokee owners or Cherokee neighbors. born of relationships that range from coercion to kinship across many decades. Many spoke the Cherokee language as their first tongue. They lived in Cherokee communities, took part in Cherokee civic and religious life, intermarried across generations, and in some cases held positions of standing in the nation. There were also free black people living in the nation before the war who became part of the same community. The line between Cherokee and Cherokee Freedmen was never a clean line of blood, and it was never even a clean line of color. It was a line drawn by who had been enslaved and who had not, a line of caste, painted over only later in the colors of race, to make a social hierarchy look like a biological fact. Pulling those two things apart, the caste line and the supposed bloodline, is the key that unlocks this entire story. So here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about this fight, and it reframes the entire conflict. The popular version treats this as a blood question. Are the freedmen really Cherokee in their blood, or are they black descendants of slaves claiming a heritage that isn't theirs? Framed that way, it sounds like a question DNA was born to answer. But that framing imports an assumption that was never part of Cherokee tradition in the first place. For most of Cherokee history, belonging had nothing to do with a measured fraction of ancestry. The Cherokee were a clan-based people. Identity flowed through kinship, through the mother's clan, through adoption, through your place in the community and the nation. A person could be fully Cherokee through these bonds. The idea that you could put a number on someone's Cherokee-ness, that you could say someone was 1/4 or 1/8 Cherokee, was not an ancient tribal concept. It was imported. It was imported by the United States through a tool called blood quantum. Around the turn of the 20th century, federal commissioners came through Indian Territory to make official membership rolls, the Dawes Rolls, as part of a scheme to break up communally held tribal land and hand it out in individual parcels, a policy designed in large part to dissolve tribal landholding altogether. To carry it out, the commissioners sorted everyone into categories and, for the first time, assigned people a fraction of Indian blood, a number often estimated on sight from nothing more than a glance at a face and a clerk's private opinion. This was the racial pseudoscience of its era turned into bureaucracy, and it was entirely foreign to how these nations had ever defined themselves. The freedmen, no matter their actual ancestry, were generally placed on a separate roll, listed simply as freedmen, frequently with their Cherokee blood recorded as nothing at all, even when everyone in the community knew a person had Cherokee parents or grandparents. The paperwork didn't measure reality. It manufactured a new one, sorted people into black and Indian as if the two could not overlap, and then froze that fiction into law where it would sit waiting for the better part of a century. Now, where does the DNA actually come in? And why couldn't it do the job everyone imagined? To understand that, you need to know what an ancestry test really sees, because it's far less than people think. Picture a letter arriving with a smudged postmark. You can make out the country it was mailed from. You can tell it came from somewhere in, say, France. But the postmark cannot tell you the town, the street, or the family that sent it. A DNA ancestry test works a lot like that postmark. It compares your genome against reference populations using markers that geneticists call ancestry informative markers, stretches of DNA that show up at different frequencies on different continents. From those, a test can estimate that some of your ancestry traces broadly to the indigenous Americas. What it cannot do is read a tribe. There is no Cherokee gene, no Seminole marker, no genetic stamp that reads Muskogee rather than Choctaw. The reason is simple once you see it. Neighboring native nations were never sealed off from one another. They shared deep ancestry and centuries of intermarriage, and the reference samples needed to even attempt tribal level matching mostly don't exist because many tribes have declined to be genetically database, a refusal that is itself an act of sovereignty. So tribes are political and kinship communities, not biologically distinct population a test can resolve. And the signal, a swab to text, is continental, not tribal. It reads the country on the postmark and stops there. This is the heart of Kim Tallbear's argument, and it is why she calls genetic tribal identity a false promise. A DNA test can suggest broad Native American ancestry. It cannot confirm that someone is Cherokee because being Cherokee was never a fact about molecules in the first place. Tall Bear's deeper warning is even sharper, that when Native people start saying it's in our DNA instead of it's in our kinship, they quietly adopt the racial logic that was invented to dispossess them, and they risk handing the definition of who is indigenous back to laboratories and to the very government that spent centuries trying to define them out of existence. The most famous demonstration of how badly this can go came in 2018, when Senator Elizabeth Warren released a DNA test meant to prove her long-claimed Native ancestry. The test suggested some distant indigenous ancestry, and Native leaders, including Cherokee Nation officials, responded not with congratulations, but with public frustration, because the entire exercise misunderstood what tribal identity actually is. A genome does not make a citizen, a nation does. The swab that the Freedmen's opponents and a great deal of the watching public imagined could settle everything was busy answering a question that no one in this fight actually needed answered. And that brings us to the deepest reversal, the place where the blood logic doesn't just fail, but turns into a weapon and then gets defeated, not by DNA, but by something older and stronger. For a century after the treaty, the freedmen were Cherokee citizens. They voted, they held office, they served on juries, they lived as members of the nation in every ordinary sense. But in the late 20th century, the nation began to change the rules. In 1983, the tribal administration moved to limit the freedmen's voting and access to benefits, requiring a degree of Indian blood the old rolls had denied them. And in 2007, after years of escalating conflict, Cherokee voters approved a constitutional amendment requiring citizens to descend from someone listed as Cherokee by blood on the Dawes rolls. With that single move, thousands of freedmen descendants, by the nation's own count, roughly 2,800 people, were stripped of the citizenship their ancestors had been explicitly guaranteed. And look closely at the machinery used to do it. The very rolls that had erased the freedmen's Cherokee ancestry a century earlier, that had stamped them freedmen with zero Indian blood, were now wielded to disqualify them for lacking the very blood those same clerks had refused to write down. The lie laid down around 1900 was being used as the weapon in 2007. The erasure had become the evidence. Then it went to the federal courts, and the resolution is the whole point of this story. The case became known as Cherokee Nation versus Nash, with the freedmen advocate Marilyn Vann, president of the Descendants of Freedmen of the 5 Civilized Tribes, among the lead plaintiffs. The pressure built for years. At one point, the federal government suspended tens of millions of dollars in housing funds to the nation over the freedmen's expulsion. And on August 30th, 2017, senior U.S. District Judge Thomas Hogan issued a lengthy ruling. He did not order a single DNA test. He did not ask what fraction of anyone's blood was Cherokee. He went back to the treaty. He held that under Article 9 of the 1866 treaty, the Cherokee Freedmen's descendants have a present right to citizenship that is, in his words, coextensive with the rights of native Cherokees. The nation, he affirmed, has every right to define itself, but it must do so even-handedly with respect to native Cherokees and freedmen alike, and it cannot use a blood requirement to break a promise its own government had signed. The Cherokee Nation chose not to appeal. In 2021, the Cherokee Nation's own Supreme Court finished the work, ordering the words "by blood" struck from the nation's constitution wherever they touched this question, and calling those words void from the very beginning. Never valid, the court said, from inception. One justice framed it as the nation stepping fully into the promise its ancestors had made at the far end of the Trail of Tears. The thing that settled the fight, in the end, was not the discovery of Cherokee blood in freedmen veins. It was the rejection of the idea that blood was ever the right measure at all. Quick pause, because this is exactly the kind of history this channel was built to recover. Documented, sourced, and told straight, without the comfortable myths and without the conspiracy spin. If that's the work you want more of, subscribe. There is far more of this that the textbooks quietly left out, and a lot of it has the same shape as this. a truth buried under a category somebody invented to keep people apart. Now, I want to be especially careful and fair about what this story does and does not mean, because the stakes here are real and current for living people, not a closed chapter in a book. This is the part that demands the most honesty, because it would be easy to flatten a genuinely hard situation into a cartoon. First, and most important, tribal sovereignty is real, and it matters enormously. A native nation's right to determine its own citizens is one of the core attributes of its nationhood, fought for over centuries against a government that tried again and again to dissolve it entirely. The Cherokee Nation's concern in this case, that a federal court reaching into its membership decisions might set a dangerous precedent for every tribe, was not frivolous, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. Judge Hogan's ruling took pains to affirm that the nation retains the power to define itself. What it cannot do, he said, is exercise that power to break a specific treaty obligation it freely signed. This was a real and painful tension between two legitimate things, a nation's sovereignty and a treaty's binding promise. The resolution honored the treaty without dissolving the sovereignty. And it's worth noting that the Cherokee Nation ultimately chose not to appeal, with its leaders coming to frame the outcome not as the defeat imposed from outside, but as the honoring of the very commitment their own ancestors had made in 1866. Second, none of this is a story of simple heroes and villains. The Cherokee Nation is, at one and the same time, a victim of one of the great crimes in American history, and a nation that practiced slavery itself. Both of those are true. Holding both at once without letting either cancel the other is what honest history requires of us. And there are still Cherokee citizens who disagree with the outcome, just as there are descendants of the other nations, the Seminole, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw, the rest of the so-called 5 tribes whose own freedmen are still fighting their own versions of this same battle under treaties signed in the very same year, with the Cherokee Resolution standing as a powerful landmark, but not yet a universal one. In some of those nations, the door remains closed. The fight the Cherokee Freedmen won is, for thousands of other families, not yet over. Third, and this one cuts directly against the grain of the entire genre, the fact that many freedmen do carry real Cherokee ancestry is true, but it is not the foundation of their claim, and it should never be treated as one. To say, the freedmen deserve citizenship because DNA proves they're really Cherokee would be to hand the whole argument back to the blood logic that was used to exclude them in the first place. Their citizenship does not rest on a blood fraction. It rests on a treaty and on belonging. That distinction is the entire soul of this case, and getting it wrong, even with good intentions, would undo everything the freedmen won. What survives all of it is the core truth. The Cherokee Freedmen were never simply black outsiders claiming a borrowed heritage, and they were never reducible to a percentage on a chart drawn up by a stranger with a quota to fill. They were, and they are, Cherokee citizens, by history, by kinship, and by the nation's own solemn word. So let's bring it home, because under the law and under the genetics, there is something here that reaches far beyond one nation's membership roles. After the 2021 ruling, the Cherokee Nation's Attorney General put the outcome into a single sentence that cut through 3 decades of argument. Cherokee citizens of freedmen descent, she said, are simply this: Cherokee citizens. Today, there are thousands of them, by the nation's own numbers, around 8,500 enrolled, who carry that status not because a laboratory ever vindicated them, but because a promise made on the far end of the Trail of Tears was finally, fully kept. Think hard about what that actually settled and what it didn't. It did not settle a question of blood, because the question of blood turned out to be the wrong question all along, a frame imposed from outside, weaponized for a century, and finally thrown out. What it settled was something deeper and more human. That belonging is not a number hidden in your cells. It is history. It is the community you come from and the obligations a nation takes on. It is a promise, and whether or not that promise is honored across the generations. The freedmen did not win by proving what was in their blood. They won by proving that what was in their blood was never supposed to be the test. And that is the reason the thing everyone expected to be the hero of this story, the DNA, the ancestry test, the genetic verdict, was never going to settle it. It couldn't. It had been answering the wrong question the entire time. There is a strange mercy in that, if you sit with it, because if belonging really did come down to a percentage in a vial, then identity would be something a laboratory could grant or revoke, and a people could be erased by a clerk with a pen, exactly as the freedmen nearly were. Instead, the real answer was written in 1866 in ink by people who had just walked out of slavery and survived a forced march, and who chose, on the far side of all that suffering, to extend a promise of equal belonging to the people who had suffered it beside them. The Cherokee Freedmen were never who we were told they were. They were citizens the whole time, and the document that finally proved it was never a strand of DNA. It was a treaty, and a nation at last living up to its own word.